The water shouldn't have been there. For 40 years, that basement had stayed bone dry, a forgotten chamber beneath an abandoned house in rural Texas. But on that October morning, when Robert Mitchell descended the creaking stairs carrying his flashlight, he found 12 inches of dark water covering the concrete floor. The liquid reflected the flashlight beam in unsettling patterns, casting shadows that danced across the damp walls. Something had changed. Something deep in the earth had shifted, and that change was about to reveal a secret that had remained buried since the 80s. A secret so disturbing that within the next 72 hours, federal agents would arrive with trucks, excavation equipment, and orders of absolute secrecy. Robert never imagined that buying that property for $50,000 would completely change his life. The deteriorated Victorian house sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by 20 acres of abandoned pasture. The nearest neighbors lived 5 miles away. It was the perfect isolation he'd been seeking after years working as an engineer in Houston, where the constant noise and chaotic traffic had eroded his mental peace. But as he stared at that mysterious water in the basement, he realized isolation had another meaning. Nobody would know what was happening here. Nobody would see what he was about to discover. And maybe that was exactly what the previous owner had wanted. Before we reveal what Robert found beneath those dark waters, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Are you discovering this mystery from a quiet countryside like Robert's new home, or from a bustling city? Share your location with our community of truth seekers. The water pump Robert brought from his pickup truck was old but reliable. He connected it to the portable generator, plunged the hose into the dark water, and pulled the ignition trigger. The motor coughed twice before roaring to life, creating a steady rumble that echoed off the basement walls. Water began to be sucked away slowly, first revealing the top of something metallic gleaming beneath the surface. Robert knelt at the edge of the still-flooded area, reaching out to touch the object. It was cold, smooth, and clearly man-made. His heart raced as the pump continued its mechanical work, lowering the water level inch by inch, gradually revealing the complete shape of what was hidden down there. When the water finally drained completely, Robert froze. Before him, embedded in the concrete floor, was a massive metal door measuring approximately 5 feet by 7 feet. The surface was covered with a layer of rust and sediment, but you could still see the emblem engraved in the center, an eagle clutching arrows and an olive branch. Government symbols. Robert had spent 30 years designing ventilation systems for commercial buildings, and he immediately recognized this wasn't ordinary residential construction. The door's thickness, the reinforced industrial hinges, the hermetic sealing system around the edges, everything indicated this was designed to withstand extreme pressure and keep something completely isolated from the outside world. His hands trembled as he cleaned the door's surface with an old cloth, removing decades of accumulated grime. Letters began to appear beneath the rust. Restricted access. Authorized personnel only. Below, an alphanumeric sequence that looked like a military identification code. Robert sat down on the damp floor, trying to process what he was seeing. He'd bought this house through a real estate auction after the previous owner's death, an elderly man named Howard Brennan, who'd lived alone there for over 40 years. Neighbors said Howard was reserved, almost reclusive, receiving rare visits and always declining social invitations. Now, Robert understood why. Howard was guarding something important enough to live an entire lifetime in complete isolation. Curiosity battled against self-preservation instinct in Robert's mind. Part of him wanted to cover that door again, pretend he'd never seen it, and continue with his quiet country life. But another part, the part that had always driven him to question, investigate, and seek answers, couldn't simply ignore it. He grabbed his pipe wrench and began working on the bolts holding the external latch closed. They were rusted and resistant, but eventually gave way. Each turn of the wrench echoed in the silent basement like a countdown. When the last bolt clattered to the floor with a metallic tink, Robert took a deep breath. There was no turning back. He was about to open a door that had been sealed for decades, and whatever was on the other side would change everything. He pulled the handle with force. At first, nothing happened. The door was stuck from rust and time. Robert adjusted his position, placed both hands on the handle, and used his body weight as leverage. Slowly, with a metallic groan that seemed to pass through his bones, the door began to move. A dark crack appeared around the edges, releasing air that had been trapped inside so long it smelled of mold, metal, and something else. Something chemical that made Robert instinctively step back. He covered his nose with his shirt sleeve and waited for the air to disperse. Through the narrow gap, all he could see was absolute darkness, a darkness that seemed to have depth, suggesting what lay below wasn't just a small compartment, but something much larger. With a final effort, Robert opened the door completely. It fell backward with a heavy thud, revealing a metal staircase descending into darkness. Robert pointed his flashlight down. The light beam barely penetrated the depth of that hole. He counted the steps he could see. 15, 20, 25. And the staircase continued descending beyond his light's reach. The walls surrounding the staircase were lined with steel-reinforced concrete, the type of construction used in military bunkers or high-security underground facilities. Robert felt a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. He was about to descend into a place that shouldn't exist, in a house he'd bought thinking it would just be a peaceful countryside retreat. The cold air rising from that hole carried echoes of a past someone had desperately tried to bury. Robert placed his foot on the first step, testing its resistance. The metal was solid despite the years. He began descending slowly, his flashlight illuminating the way, each step taking him deeper beneath his new property. As he descended, the air grew colder and the silence more oppressive. It was like entering a burial chamber, a place where time had stopped completely. And at the end of that staircase, waiting in the shadows for decades, was the truth that would make Robert grab his cell phone 3 hours later and dial a number he never imagined he'd need: the FBI. Robert Mitchell wasn't the type of man who sought adventures or mysteries. At 53 years old, his life had been built on a foundation of predictable routines and calculated decisions. A mechanical engineering graduate from the University of Texas, he'd spent 3 decades designing HVAC systems for corporate skyscrapers in Houston, work that required absolute technical precision but offered little excitement. His divorce 5 years earlier had left him financially stable but emotionally exhausted. When his grown children followed their own lives to distant cities, Robert realized nothing was tying him to the suffocating metropolis anymore. He wanted silence. He wanted space. He wanted a place where he could finally hear his own thoughts without the constant noise of modern city life. The property appeared on a real estate auction website in March of 2025. The description was basic: Victorian house of 6,000 square feet, built in 1922, situated on 20 acres of rural land in Gonzales County, Texas. The starting price was absurdly low, $30,000, which immediately raised suspicions. Houses in that region, even in poor condition, were normally auctioned for at least $100,000. Robert studied the online photos. The house clearly needed work: peeling paint, damaged roof, rotted porches, but the structure looked solid. The bones were good, as builders would say. With $50,000 invested in renovations, this could become his perfect retreat. What the website didn't mention, and Robert only discovered later, was the shadowy history surrounding the property. Howard Brennan, the previous owner, was found dead in his bed by a concerned mail carrier after 3 weeks of accumulated correspondence in the mailbox. The official cause of death was heart failure, nothing unusual for an 87-year-old man. But neighbors whispered more disturbing stories. They said Howard never allowed visitors, that strange lights were sometimes seen through the basement windows late at night, that unmarked trucks occasionally appeared on his property during the early morning hours. Some speculated he was involved with smuggling. Others suggested he was just an eccentric, paranoid Cold War survivor. Nobody really knew the truth about Howard Brennan. Robert made his first visit to the property on a cloudy April afternoon. The dirt road leading to the house was in terrible condition, full of potholes and fallen branches. When he finally spotted the building through the trees, he felt a strange mixture of attraction and unease. The house had 3 floors with an octagonal tower on the southeast corner, typical of Victorian architecture. The tall, narrow windows looked like empty eyes watching his approach. The original white paint had peeled down to gray, giving the structure a ghostly appearance. But there was something else, a sensation Robert couldn't quite define. It was as if the house was guarding something, protecting a secret buried so deeply that even the walls seemed heavy with its weight. He parked his pickup and walked around the property. The 20 acres stretched in all directions, mostly pastures covered with tall grass and some scattered trees. There were no neighbors in sight. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional bird song and the whisper of wind through the grass. It was exactly the isolation Robert was seeking. He checked the house's foundation, inspected the roof as best he could from the ground, tested doors and windows. Everything seemed structurally sound, just neglected. The house hadn't been lived in, only existed, waiting patiently for decades. When Robert entered through the front door, the floorboards groaned beneath his feet but held his weight. Dust covered all surfaces. Old furniture remained in place, as if Howard had simply vanished in the middle of his daily life. The basement was accessed through a narrow door in the kitchen. Robert descended the wooden stairs carefully, lighting the way with his phone's flashlight. The space was surprisingly large, spanning the entire area of the house above. The ceiling was low, forcing Robert to slightly lower his head. The floor was solid concrete, completely dry despite decades of potential water infiltration. Rusted metal shelves lined the walls, some still containing dusty cans of preserves and old supplies. But what caught Robert's attention most was the absence of cracks or moisture signs. For a basement built over 100 years ago, this was remarkably well preserved. He had no way of knowing at that moment he was standing directly over the door that would change everything. Robert made an offer of $50,000 at the auction, expecting competition from other interested parties. There was none. Perhaps the property's shadowy reputation kept other buyers away, or maybe the remote location simply didn't attract modern investors. Either way, the house was his for that surprisingly low price. He spent the following month preparing for the move, selling or donating most of his possessions in Houston, keeping only essentials. At the end of May, he loaded his pickup with tools, some clothes, his laptop, and a few books, and drove 3 hours to his new life in the country. When he arrived, the house greeted him with the same heavy silence he'd noticed on the first visit. A silence he now understood wasn't peace, but secrecy. The first months were dedicated to basic repairs. Robert fixed the roof, replaced broken windows, painted the exterior walls, and installed a new electrical system. He worked during the day under the scorching Texas sun and rested at night on an air mattress in what would eventually be his bedroom. The solitude didn't bother him. In fact, he embraced it. After years surrounded by millions of people in Houston, being able to walk his property without seeing another living soul was therapeutic. He established a simple routine: wake with the sun, work on renovations until noon, lunch on the porch while observing the empty fields, resume work until dusk, and then spend evenings reading under lantern light until sleep came. It was a monastic existence, but exactly what he needed. In September, the rains came. Violent storms swept through Gonzales County for 3 consecutive weeks, dumping record amounts of precipitation. The saturated soil couldn't absorb more water. Creeks overflowed. Roads transformed into rivers of mud. And something deep beneath Robert's property began to change. The water table rose dramatically, pressing against that sealed metal door in the basement, searching for any weakness in the hermetic seal that had held for 4 decades. Eventually, microscopic cracks gave way. Water began infiltrating. slowly at first, then in greater volume. When Robert descended to the basement that October morning, finding 12 inches of water covering the floor, he had no idea that flooding was actually a revelation. The earth was forcing a buried secret to emerge, refusing to keep it hidden any longer. The metal stairs groaned under Robert's weight as he descended deeper into the earth beneath his property. Each step took him further from the familiar world of his basement and closer to something that defied rational explanation. The concrete walls were perfectly smooth, showing no signs of amateur construction. This was professional military-grade work. Robert counted 38 steps before his boots finally touched solid ground. The air down here was different, not just cold, but sterile, as if it had been filtered and recycled through machinery that had long since stopped functioning. His flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing a corridor stretching ahead into darkness. The ceiling was reinforced with steel beams spaced every 6 feet, and thick cables ran along the walls, leading deeper into the complex. This wasn't a simple hidden room. This was an entire underground facility. The corridor extended approximately 50 feet before opening into a larger chamber. Robert's hands were steady now, the initial shock replaced by focused determination to understand what he'd stumbled upon. The walls were lined with electrical panels, their gauges frozen at various readings, circuit breakers locked in positions they'd held for decades. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust that puffed into the air with his slightest movement. On his right, a metal door bore the stenciled words "Communications Center" in faded military lettering. On his left, another door read "Living Quarters." Robert tried the handle of the communications room first. It turned easily, and the door swung open with a soft creak that echoed down the corridor like a whisper from the past. The communications center was a time capsule from the Cold War era. Banks of radio equipment lined the walls, their dials and switches frozen in silence. A large map of the United States covered one wall, marked with circles and numbers that Robert didn't immediately understand. Beneath the map, a wooden desk held a logbook, its pages yellowed but still legible. Robert picked it up carefully, the leather binding cracking slightly in his hands. The first entry was dated June 15, 1982. Project Sanctuary operational. All systems green. Awaiting further instructions from command. Robert flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning entries that spoke of regular system checks, supply inventories, and cryptic references to protocols and contingency procedures. The last entry was dated November 3, 1984. Systems entering hibernation mode. Will maintain monthly checks until reactivation orders received. There were no more entries after that. Robert set the logbook down and examined the radio equipment more closely. These weren't civilian radios. They were military-grade communication systems designed for encrypted transmissions. He recognized some of the models from his engineering days, equipment that had been cutting-edge in the early 80s but was now hopelessly obsolete. One console had a red telephone sitting in a special cradle, the kind of secure line that in movies always connected directly to government command centers. Robert lifted the receiver and held it to his ear, half expecting to hear something. There was nothing but silence, not even the hiss of an open line. Whatever network this equipment had been connected to, it had been dead for decades. But the fact that it existed at all raised terrifying questions about what Howard Brennan had really been doing in this house. He left the communications center and crossed the corridor to check the living quarters. This door was heavier, reinforced like a vault, but it too opened without resistance. Inside was a small apartment designed for extended occupation, a narrow bed with military-style blankets neatly folded at the foot, a compact kitchenette with a 2-burner electric stove and a small refrigerator that no longer hummed, a table with 2 chairs, shelves stocked with canned food, most labels faded but still readable, beans, soup, vegetables, all with expiration dates from the mid-'80s. There was even a small bathroom with a chemical toilet and a shower stall. This wasn't designed for brief visits. Someone could live down here for weeks, maybe months, completely cut off from the world above. Robert stood in the middle of that sterile little apartment and felt the full weight of understanding crash over him like a wave. This was a Cold War bunker, a secret government facility built during the height of nuclear paranoia. But why here? Why in a random Victorian house in rural Texas? Robert thought about the location. Far from major cities, isolated from main roads, surrounded by empty land where unusual activity wouldn't draw attention. It was actually perfect for a clandestine operation. But what operation? The communications equipment suggested this was more than just a bomb shelter. This was an active facility, manned and operational for at least 2 years based on the logbook entries. And Howard Brennan must have been the operator, the guardian of whatever secret purpose this place served. Robert wondered if the old man had ever told anyone. Had he carried this burden alone for 40 years, living directly above this hidden world, never speaking of it until he died in his sleep? If you're enjoying this discovery, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next find. We're just beginning to uncover the truth about what was hidden beneath this innocent-looking farmhouse, and what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about Cold War America. Robert moved back into the main corridor, his flashlight revealing a third door at the far end. This one was different from the others, heavier, with a wheel lock mechanism like those found on bank vaults or submarine hatches. Yellow and black hazard stripes were painted around the frame, and a weathered sign warned, "Authorized access only. Security clearance level 5 required." Robert's pulse quickened. Everything else in this facility had been concerning, but this door radiated genuine menace. Whatever was behind it was the real secret, the thing that required the most protection. He approached slowly, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. The wheel lock was stiff with age, but when he gripped it and turned, decades-old mechanisms groaned to life. The lock disengaged with a series of heavy clicks and the door swung inward, revealing absolute darkness beyond. Robert stepped through the threshold and immediately knew this chamber was larger than the others. His flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by the space, barely illuminating objects he couldn't yet identify. He swept the light across the walls, searching for a power switch, and found a panel near the door. The switches were old-fashioned toggle types, large and industrial. Robert hesitated, wondering if power could still reach down here after all these years. But the facility must have had its own generator system, and if the logbook was accurate, it had been designed for long-term hibernation. He took a breath and flipped the main switch. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then, with a distant hum that grew steadily louder, lights began flickering to life across the ceiling, revealing the chamber in stuttering illumination. Robert's breath caught in his throat. The room was enormous, at least 60 feet across and 40 feet deep, but it wasn't the size that stunned him. It was the contents. Row after row of metal shelving units filled the space, and on those shelves sat hundreds of sealed containers, each about the size of a shoebox, all bearing identical labels with biohazard symbols and alphanumeric codes. In the center of the room stood what looked like laboratory equipment: sealed glove boxes for handling dangerous materials, microscopes under protective covers, refrigeration units with massive locks. Along the far wall, a bank of filing cabinets promised documentation of whatever had been stored and studied here. This wasn't just a communications outpost or a survival shelter. This was a research facility, buried beneath a farmhouse, holding materials that someone had deemed too dangerous or too sensitive to exist in any official government installation. Robert walked slowly between the shelving units, his mind reeling. Each container was labeled with codes that meant nothing to him, but the biohazard warnings were universal. Some labels included dates, ranging from 1979 to 1984, and origin locations that had been partially redacted with black marker. He could make out fragments. From Site 42. Recovered from Nevada test. Prototype Batch 7B. The implications were staggering. This facility wasn't just storing dangerous materials, it was hiding them, keeping them off official records, making them disappear into the Texas countryside where nobody would ever think to look. And Howard Brennan had been the keeper, the silent guardian of secrets that officially didn't exist. Robert pulled out his cell phone, his hands shaking slightly, and began taking photographs. Whatever this was, it was bigger than him, bigger than this house. This required authorities. This required answers. Robert stood in that underground laboratory for 20 minutes, photographing everything his phone's camera could capture. The sealed containers, the equipment, the filing cabinets, the hazard warnings. All of it documented in digital images that suddenly made his phone feel like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He was holding evidence of something that had been deliberately hidden from public record, something that powerful people had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury. The question gnawing at him was whether those people still existed, still cared about keeping these secrets buried, and what they might do if they discovered someone had stumbled upon their hidden facility. Robert wasn't paranoid by nature, but standing in a secret government laboratory 60 feet underground, he felt the first real tendrils of fear wrapping around his chest. He needed to get out. He needed fresh air. He needed to think. The climb back up the metal staircase felt longer than the descent. Each step carried him back toward normalcy, but he knew normal was gone forever. He could never unsee what was beneath his house. He could never pretend this didn't exist. When he finally reached the basement level and stepped back into the familiar space with its old shelves and concrete floor, the morning sunlight streaming through the high windows seemed almost surreal. How could the world above be so ordinary when something so extraordinary existed just below? Robert walked upstairs to the kitchen, his legs unsteady, and collapsed into a chair at the table. His mind raced through options. He could seal the door, pretend he'd never found it, live his life in this house knowing what lay beneath but never speaking of it. That's what Howard Brennan had done after all. But that thought made Robert's stomach turn. Howard Brennan had lived alone for 40 years, never forming close relationships, never letting anyone into his home, dying quietly in his bed with his secrets intact. Was that really living? Or was it just existing, trapped by knowledge too heavy to share but too dangerous to reveal? Robert imagined decades stretching ahead of him, every conversation with neighbors shadowed by the lie of omission, every night sleeping above that facility knowing it contained materials that could potentially harm people if they ever leaked or deteriorated. He imagined growing old like Howard, isolated and paranoid, his life consumed by the protection of secrets that weren't even his to keep. No, that wasn't the life he'd moved here to find. He'd come seeking peace, not imprisonment. If he stayed silent, he'd become Howard's successor, another lonely guardian of buried truths. But reporting it brought its own dangers. Government black sites didn't stay secret by accident. They stayed secret because people with power wanted them secret, and those people had resources to ensure silence. Robert thought about the movies he'd seen, the conspiracy theories he'd dismissed as paranoid fantasy. They didn't seem so fantastical anymore. Still, this was America in 2025, not some authoritarian state where people disappeared for knowing too much. There were laws, oversight committees, whistleblower protections. If he went to the right authorities with proper documentation, surely he'd be protected. Surely they'd be interested in discovering a Cold War facility that had been operating off the books. Wouldn't they? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but one thing was clear. Keeping this secret was not an option he could live with. He spent the next hour researching on his laptop. Who did you call when you found a secret government facility under your house? Local police seemed absurdly inadequate. What would a rural county sheriff do with information about Cold War bioweapon storage? State authorities? Federal? Robert searched for the proper FBI reporting channels for potential national security issues. The FBI's website had a section for submitting tips about threats to national security, But somehow typing this into a web form seemed both insufficient and potentially dangerous. What if the wrong people monitored those submissions? What if this facility had been deliberately kept off official records, meaning some faction within the government might prefer it stayed hidden? Robert's engineering mind, trained to think systematically about problems, was struggling with variables he couldn't quantify or control. Finally, he found a direct phone number for the FBI's San Antonio field office, which covered Gonzales County. It was Saturday afternoon, but the number was answered by a duty agent who listened as Robert carefully explained he'd found something unusual on his property that might have national security implications. He deliberately kept details vague over the phone, saying only that it appeared to be an old government facility. The agent asked standard questions. Was anyone in danger? Were there any immediate threats? Had Robert disturbed anything? Robert answered carefully, and the agent said someone would be dispatched to his location within 2 hours to assess the situation. 2 hours. Robert hung up and stared at his phone. He'd just crossed a line. There was no going back now. Whatever happened next was out of his control. Those 2 hours felt like 2 days. Robert paced through his house, checking the windows obsessively, watching the long driveway for approaching vehicles. He made coffee but couldn't drink it. He tried to eat something but had no appetite. His mind kept returning to that underground laboratory, to those hundreds of sealed containers with their biohazard warnings. What was in them? Chemical weapons, biological agents, radioactive materials. The Cold War had been characterized by paranoia and secret programs, governments on both sides developing weapons they hoped never to use but wanted ready just in case. How much of that research had been conducted in hidden facilities like the one beneath his house? How many other properties across America had similar secrets buried beneath innocent-looking homes? At 3:45 p.m., Robert spotted a black SUV turning onto his property. It moved slowly up the rutted driveway, followed by a second identical vehicle. Robert's mouth went dry. 2 vehicles meant multiple agents, meant they were taking this seriously. The SUVs parked in front of his house, and 4 people emerged. 3 men and 1 woman, all wearing dark suits and sunglasses despite the overcast sky. They had that unmistakable bearing of federal agents, alert, professional, radiating authority. The tallest man, who appeared to be in his 50s with gray temples and sharp eyes, approached Robert's porch while the others hung back by the vehicles. He pulled out credentials identifying him as Special Agent Marcus Reeves, FBI. His handshake was firm, his expression unreadable. He asked Robert to explain what he'd found, and Robert led them all inside. The agents' reactions when they descended into the facility were everything Robert had expected and feared. Professional facades cracked for just a moment. Widened eyes, exchanged glances, subtle shifts in body language that revealed shock beneath the trained composure. Special Agent Reeves spent 10 minutes examining the communications center, the living quarters, and finally the main laboratory. He took photographs with a professional camera, spoke quietly into a radio calling for additional resources, and asked Robert detailed questions about how he'd found the facility, whether he'd touched anything, whether he'd told anyone else. Robert answered honestly, feeling oddly like he was confessing to a crime rather than reporting a discovery. When they returned to the main basement level, Agent Reeves made a phone call that lasted 5 minutes, speaking in low tones that Robert couldn't quite overhear. When the call ended, Agent Reeves' expression was grave. He explained that what Robert had found was indeed a government facility, one that had been classified and then apparently forgotten during the chaos of bureaucratic transitions in the late 80s. The materials in the laboratory needed immediate assessment by hazmat specialists and potentially by experts from the Department of Energy and the CDC. Within hours, Robert's property would become a secure site. More agents would arrive, specialists in protective gear, equipment trucks. The area would need to be cordoned off while they determined exactly what was stored in those containers and whether there was any danger of contamination. Robert asked if he could stay in his house. Agent Reeves hesitated, then said the decision would be made by higher authorities, but Robert should pack a bag just in case. Those words hit Robert like a physical blow. After everything he'd done to escape his old life and build something peaceful here, he might lose it all because of secrets buried by people he'd never met, for purposes he couldn't understand. As the sun began setting that evening, Robert stood on his porch watching more vehicles arrive. Federal agents, hazmat teams, what looked like military personnel in unmarked uniforms. His quiet countryside property had transformed into a command center. Floodlights were being erected. A communications tent appeared on his front lawn. Generator trucks rumbled to life, and through it all, Robert felt a strange mixture of vindication and loss. He'd done the right thing by calling authorities, but the right thing had cost him his peace, his privacy, his carefully constructed new life. He thought about Howard Brennan again, understanding now why the old man had chosen silence, not because he was evil or complicit, but because sometimes the burden of truth is lighter than the chaos of revelation. Sometimes secrets stay buried not because they're protected, but because unearthing them destroys everything around them. And Robert, standing on his porch watching his property disappear under federal occupation, was learning that lesson the hardest way possible. By midnight, Robert's property looked like a scene from a disaster movie. Floodlights illuminated the entire area, turning night into artificial day. White tents had been erected near the house, creating a sterile command center where agents in hazmat suits moved with practiced efficiency. Robert sat in his kitchen, the only room he was still permitted to occupy, watching through the window as teams descended into his basement carrying specialized equipment. Special Agent Reeves had remained on site, coordinating the operation with a calm authority that somehow made everything feel more real and more frightening. Around 10 p.m., he'd brought Robert a sandwich and coffee from somewhere, an unexpected kindness that made Robert realize how long it had been since he'd eaten. But food sat untouched on the table as Robert watched his world transform into something unrecognizable. The hazmat teams worked through the night in shifts, carefully documenting every container in the underground laboratory before transporting them to a refrigerated truck parked in Robert's front yard. Each container was photographed, cataloged, and placed in secondary containment before being moved. The process was painstakingly slow. By 2 a.m., they'd only removed perhaps 30 of the hundreds of containers. Robert dozed fitfully in his chair, jerking awake whenever he heard voices or equipment moving. Around 4 a.m., there was sudden activity. Agents moving quickly, radios crackling with urgent communication. Robert stood up, his heart pounding. But Special Agent Reeves appeared at his door before he could go outside, his expression carefully neutral. They'd found something significant, he said. They needed to accelerate the timeline. Robert needed to pack a bag now. Within an hour, Robert found himself in a hotel room in San Antonio, 70 miles from his property. 2 junior agents had driven him there in silence, refusing to answer his questions beyond assuring him this was for his own safety and he'd be briefed soon. The hotel was nice, a corporate chain near the airport, but the room felt like a cage. Robert stood at the window watching planes take off and land, their lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, and wondered if he'd ever see his house again. Everything he'd worked for over the past 6 months, the repairs, the renovations, the carefully constructed solitude, had been swept away in less than 12 hours. He thought about calling his kids, but what would he say? He'd been ordered not to discuss what he'd found with anyone outside law enforcement. So he sat on the edge of the hotel bed, exhausted but unable to sleep, waiting for answers that might never come. Those answers began arriving at 9 a.m. when Special Agent Reeves knocked on his door, accompanied by a severe-looking woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Holloway from the Department of Energy. They sat at the small table by the window, and Dr. Holloway opened a leather portfolio containing photographs and documents. Her voice was clinical, professional, as she explained what the hazmat teams had found. The containers held biological samples, specifically weaponized pathogens that had been developed during a classified military research program in the early 1980s. The program, codenamed Project Sanctuary, had been tasked with creating biological agents that could be deployed in combat situations, then developing countermeasures and treatments. It was, she said carefully, not technically illegal under international treaties because it was classified as defensive research. But it had been deeply controversial even within government circles. Project Sanctuary had been abruptly terminated in 1984 when its lead researcher raised concerns about safety protocols and the potential for the weaponized agents to be misused. Rather than properly decommissioning the materials, a process that would have required extensive documentation and oversight, someone in the program's chain of command had made a different decision. They'd hidden everything. The entire laboratory, all the biological samples, all the research documentation had been secretly relocated to the facility beneath Howard Brennan's house. Brennan had been a military intelligence officer, Dr. Holloway explained, someone trusted with secrets, someone who understood the gravity of what he was guarding. He'd been tasked with maintaining the facility indefinitely, keeping it ready for potential reactivation while ensuring nobody discovered its existence. He'd done that job for 4 decades, until his death released the secret from his protection. The pathogens in those containers included modified strains of anthrax, tularemia, and several experimental viruses that Dr. Holloway didn't name. Most were still viable, she said, her tone making clear how dangerous that was. If any of those containers had corroded or been damaged by the flooding, if the seals had failed, Robert could have been exposed to agents that had no available treatment. The entire area could have been contaminated. It was, she said with remarkable understatement, extraordinarily fortunate that he'd called the FBI immediately rather than attempting to open any containers or further explore the facility. Robert felt his stomach turn. He'd been standing in that laboratory walking between those shelves, breathing air that might have been contaminated. He asked the question he was terrified to hear answered. Was he in danger? Had he been exposed? Doctor. Holloway exchanged a glance with Special Agent Reeves before responding. They'd conducted preliminary air quality tests in the facility, and so far everything appeared contained. The seals on the containers had held despite decades of neglect. Robert's brief exposure was unlikely to have caused contamination, but they wanted him to undergo medical screening as a precaution. They'd arranged for a comprehensive examination at a military medical facility that afternoon. It would include blood tests, imaging, and observation over the next 48 hours. If everything came back clear, he'd be released. Robert nodded numbly, trying to process the information. He'd thought finding the facility was the crisis. Now he understood that was just the beginning. The real danger had been there all along, sealed in hundreds of containers, waiting for time or accident to release it. The medical screening was as invasive as it was thorough. Doctors and nurses in a secure facility at Fort Sam Houston drew what felt like gallons of blood, ran him through scanning machines, asked endless questions about symptoms he didn't have. Through it all, Robert felt detached, like he was watching someone else's life spiral into surrealism. By evening, preliminary results suggested no exposure. His blood work was normal, no signs of infection or contamination. But they wanted him to stay overnight for observation, sleeping in a sterile room while monitors tracked his vital signs. Robert lay in the narrow hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how quickly everything had changed. 4 days ago, his biggest concern was fixing a leaking pipe. Now he was in military quarantine being tested for exposure to weaponized pathogens. He was released the following afternoon with assurances that he showed no signs of exposure. Special Agent Reeves met him at the facility's entrance, offering a ride back to the hotel. During the drive, Reeves explained what would happen next. The decontamination and removal operation would take at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. Robert couldn't return to his property during that time. The government would cover his hotel expenses and provide a daily stipend for meals. Once the facility was cleared and deemed safe, Structural engineers would assess whether the underground complex needed to be filled in or could simply be sealed. Eventually, Reeves emphasized that word, Robert would get his house back. But eventually wasn't now, and Robert heard the unspoken truth beneath the careful bureaucratic language. His life would never be the same. That night, alone in his hotel room, Robert finally called his daughter Sarah in Denver. He kept the story vague, said there'd been structural issues with the house requiring government assessment because of potential environmental contamination. Sarah was concerned, but not alarmed. She'd always thought buying that old house was risky anyway. When she suggested maybe this was a sign he should move somewhere more practical, Robert found himself unable to respond. More practical than what? A house with a secret bioweapons laboratory in the basement? How did you measure practicality against that? He ended the call quickly, claiming exhaustion, and sat in the dark room feeling utterly alone. He'd thought isolation was what he wanted when he moved to Texas. Now he understood the difference between chosen solitude and forced separation. One was peace. The other was exile. The hotel became Robert's prison for the next 3 weeks. Every morning he'd wake up hoping for a call saying he could go home, and every morning Special Agent Reeves would instead provide an update on the decontamination progress. The operation had expanded far beyond the initial assessment. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed the underground facility was even larger than they'd first thought. It extended beyond the house's footprint, with additional chambers that hadn't been immediately visible from the main laboratory. Those chambers contained more materials, more secrets, more complications that extended the timeline. Robert listened to these updates in numb silence, watching his savings account slowly drain as incidental expenses piled up. The government covered his room and basic meals, but life cost money in ways the daily stipend didn't account for. By the second week, media had gotten wind of the story. Robert woke up one morning to find his phone flooded with messages from reporters, his name appearing in news articles about a Cold War discovery in rural Texas. Someone had leaked information, not the full story, but enough to create speculation and conspiracy theories. Articles described a former government facility discovered on private property, with officials declining to comment on its purpose or contents. Internet forums exploded with theories: secret nuclear materials, alien artifacts, underground bunkers for government officials preparing for doomsday scenarios. The truth was somehow both more mundane and more terrifying than the speculation, but Robert couldn't correct the record. He'd been required to sign non-disclosure agreements, documents that legally bound him to silence about specific details of what he'd found. The attention made everything worse. Reporters tracked him to the hotel, ambushing him in the parking lot with cameras and questions he couldn't answer. His phone rang constantly with numbers he didn't recognize. His email inbox filled with messages from conspiracy theorists, amateur historians, and people claiming they'd experienced similar discoveries. Robert stopped answering calls, stopped checking email, essentially disconnected from the world. Special Agent Reeves arranged to move him to a different hotel under an assumed name, but the isolation only deepened. He was trapped between public attention he couldn't acknowledge and private knowledge he couldn't share, existing in a liminal space where nothing felt real anymore. His peaceful retirement had become a nightmare of bureaucracy, secrecy, and unwanted fame. Financial stress began adding to psychological strain. Robert's savings were substantial but not infinite. The house renovation had consumed a significant portion of his retirement funds, and now he was bleeding money on duplicate living expenses, paying for the hotel incidentals beyond what the government covered while still being responsible for his property's utilities and insurance. He tried to file a claim arguing the government should compensate him for the disruption, but the process involved forms and procedures that would take months to resolve. Meanwhile, bills kept arriving. His credit card balance grew. The comfortable financial cushion that had made early retirement possible was eroding week by week. Robert found himself doing something he'd never imagined. calculating how long he could sustain this situation before his money ran out. On the 18th day, Special Agent Reeves arrived with news and a request. The decontamination was nearly complete, but there was a complication. The underground facility's structural integrity had been compromised during the removal process. Something about the way the chambers had been excavated originally created instabilities that made the entire complex a collapse risk. The safest solution was to fill it entirely with concrete, permanently sealing it. But doing so would require Robert's permission since it was technically his property. Reeves placed papers on the hotel room table. Documents authorizing the government to conduct the sealing work, agreements releasing them from future liability, waivers of Robert's right to sue for property damage. Robert stared at the papers, understanding what they really meant. Sign here to erase the evidence. Sign here to make this officially never have happened. He signed. What choice did he have? Fighting would mean lawyers, years of litigation against the federal government, costs he couldn't afford. And what would he win? The right to keep a collapsed bioweapons laboratory under his house. The right to live above a sealed tomb of Cold War secrets? Robert signed every page, his handwriting mechanical, feeling like he was signing away more than just property rights. He was signing away the truth, agreeing to let it be buried again, this time literally. When he handed the papers back to Special Agent Reeves, the agent's expression was sympathetic but firm. This was how these things worked, that expression said. Secrets stayed buried. People moved on. Life continued. But Robert wondered if his life could continue, or if something essential had been taken from him in that sterile hotel room. What would you do with this knowledge if you were Robert? Would you fight the government for transparency, or accept the compensation and try to move forward? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're finding this story as gripping as we are, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. We're almost at the end of this incredible story, but make sure to enable notifications. You won't want to miss how this finally resolves. 2 days later, Robert was allowed to return to his property. The drive from San Antonio felt longer than he remembered, the familiar Texas landscape seeming somehow foreign after weeks away. When he turned onto his property, he almost didn't recognize it. The yard had been torn up by heavy equipment, then hastily restored with fresh sod that didn't match the surrounding grass. The house itself looked the same from the outside, but when he entered the basement, the difference was stark. Where the metal door had been, there was now solid concrete, professionally poured and finished. You couldn't even tell something had been there. It was as if the entire underground facility had never existed. The government had made it disappear, erased 40 years of secrets and Robert's discovery alike. The house felt wrong now. Robert tried to resume his normal routines, working on renovations, cooking meals, reading in the evenings, but everything was tainted by knowledge he couldn't forget. At night, lying in bed, he'd think about what was beneath him. Not the facility anymore, but its ghost. The absence of something that had been there, now sealed behind tons of concrete. He'd think about Howard Brennan, wondering if the old man had felt this same oppressive weight every day of his isolation. Had Howard chosen his solitude, or had it been forced upon him by what he knew and couldn't share? Robert was starting to understand that maybe there'd been no choice for Howard, just as there was no real choice for him now. Some knowledge was a cage you couldn't escape. The compensation check arrived 6 weeks after he'd signed the documents. It was substantial. $350,000, payment for property damage, mental distress, and what the accompanying letter called inconvenience resulting from matters of national security. It was more money than Robert had expected, enough to complete all the renovations he'd planned and still have significant savings. But as he stared at the check, all he felt was hollow. They were buying his silence, buying his complicity in the cover-up. The money was supposed to make everything okay, supposed to compensate for having his life turned upside down. But how did you put a price on peace of mind? How did you calculate compensation for the loss of the simple, quiet life he'd moved here to find? Robert deposited the check and tried to move forward. He hired contractors to finish the renovations he'd been working on alone, accelerating the timeline. He installed new appliances, refinished the floors, painted every room. The house slowly transformed into the comfortable home he'd originally envisioned. But it remained empty. Robert realized that what he'd been seeking wasn't just physical space or quiet surroundings. It was peace, the kind that comes from simplicity and straightforward living. That peace was gone, replaced by complexity he could never explain to anyone. Friends from Houston called occasionally, asking how retirement was going. "Fine," he'd say. "Quiet, exactly what I needed." The lies came easily now, another skill he'd learned since October, another price paid for living with secrets. Winter arrived in Texas with uncharacteristic cold, bringing frost that turned Robert's fields silver in the mornings. He'd been back in the house for 3 months now, and the renovations were essentially complete. The Victorian structure gleamed with fresh paint, new windows reflected the winter sun, and the interior had been transformed from neglected decay into comfortable modern living. By any objective measure, Robert had succeeded in creating the peaceful retirement home he'd envisioned. But success felt hollow when every footstep on the basement floor reminded him of what lay beneath. The concrete was solid, professionally installed, permanent. But Robert could still see the outline of that metal door in his mind, could still remember the cold air rising from the underground facility, could still feel the weight of those sealed containers holding decades-old death. The nightmares started in December. Robert would dream he was back in the underground laboratory, but in the dreams the containers were open, their contents spreading through the air like fog. He'd wake up gasping, checking his hands for signs of contamination that weren't there, his heart racing with panic that took hours to subside. Sleep became something to fear rather than welcome. He'd lie awake until exhaustion forced him under, then jerk awake after brief, troubled rest. The lack of sleep affected everything: his appetite, his energy, his ability to focus on simple tasks. He'd start projects around the property and abandon them halfway through, forgetting why he'd begun. The isolation he'd once craved now felt suffocating, the silence oppressive rather than peaceful. In January, Robert drove into town for supplies and stopped at a local diner for lunch. It was a small place, the kind where everyone knew everyone, and Robert had been there enough times to be recognized if not yet fully accepted by the regulars. He ordered his usual burger and coffee, sitting at the counter trying to lose himself in the normalcy of small-town life. 2 men, a few stools down, were talking about the government thing that had happened out at the old Brennan place. Robert froze, fork halfway to his mouth. One man was saying he'd heard they'd found toxic waste from old military operations. The other claimed it was something to do with nuclear materials. Neither was right, but Robert couldn't correct them. He sat in silence, chewing food that tasted like cardboard, listening to speculation about his own life. The conversation shifted to Howard Brennan, and Robert found himself leaning in to listen. The older of the 2 men had apparently known Howard decades ago, before the old man became a complete recluse. "He was different when he first moved here," the man said, his voice carrying that reflective tone people use when remembering the dead. "Early 70s, I think it was. He'd come into town regular, have a beer at the tavern, talk about his time in the service. But something changed in the 80s. He just shut down, stopped coming around. Few times I saw him after that, he looked haunted, like he was carrying weight nobody else could see." The words hit Robert like a punch. That's exactly how he felt. Haunted, weighted down by knowledge that isolated him from normal human connection. Robert paid his bill and left quickly, driving back to his property with hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. Back home, he found himself pulling out his laptop and searching for information about Howard Brennan. There wasn't much. A brief obituary noting his military service, a death certificate listing heart failure, property records showing he'd purchased the house in 1973. No family mentioned, no surviving relatives, no personal history beyond bare facts. Howard had lived 87 years and left almost no trace beyond the secret he'd guarded. Robert wondered if anyone had truly known him, if anyone had understood what his life had cost. Or had Howard died as alone as he'd lived, taking his burden to the grave without ever sharing the weight with another human being? That thought terrified Robert more than the bioweapons, more than the government cover-up, more than the nightmares. The idea that he might follow Howard's path, gradually withdrawing from human connection, growing old in isolation, dying alone with his secrets, felt like a preview of a future he couldn't accept. He needed to talk to someone, needed to share at least part of what he was experiencing. But who? His non-disclosure agreements prevented discussing specifics. His kids wouldn't understand without details he couldn't provide. Friends from his old life were distant, both geographically and emotionally. Robert sat in his renovated living room, surrounded by comfort he'd worked hard to create, and felt more alone than he'd ever felt in the crowded chaos of Houston. In February, Special Agent Reeves called unexpectedly. It was the first contact Robert had received from anyone connected to the investigation since he'd deposited the compensation check. Reeves's voice was professionally cordial, asking how Robert was adjusting, whether he'd had any ongoing concerns or questions. The words sounded rehearsed, like a script Reeves had been required to deliver. Robert almost said he was fine, almost played along with the fiction that everything was back to normal. But something broke inside him. Some wall he'd been maintaining crumbled, and instead he told the truth. He described the nightmares, the isolation, the crushing weight of living with knowledge he couldn't share. There was a long pause after he finished speaking. Then Reeves said something unexpected. There are resources available. Support services for people who've been exposed to classified situations. Resources. Support services. Bureaucratic language for therapy, Robert realized. Counseling for people traumatized by encounters with government secrets. Reeves explained that there was a network of cleared psychologists who worked with individuals in situations like Robert's, people who'd stumbled onto classified materials, whistleblowers, former intelligence officers dealing with the psychological aftermath of their work. These therapists had security clearances that allowed patients to discuss things they couldn't share with regular counselors. It wasn't widely advertised, Reeves said, because advertising would acknowledge the need, and the government preferred not to acknowledge that encounters with classified materials could cause lasting trauma. But the resources existed. Robert could be referred if he wanted. It would be confidential, covered under the same classification that protected the details of what he'd found. Robert accepted the referral immediately, feeling something like hope for the first time in months. 2 weeks later, he found himself in a nondescript office building in Austin, sitting across from Dr. Ellen Martinez, a psychologist who specialized in what she carefully called national security-related stress. She was in her 40s, with warm eyes and a direct manner that put Robert somewhat at ease. She began by assuring him that their conversations were protected by both doctor-patient confidentiality and classification protocols. Anything he said would remain between them. Then she asked him to tell his story from the beginning. And for the first time since October, Robert talked. He described finding the water, opening the door, descending into the facility, the containers, the government response, the compensation, the aftermath. Everything he'd been holding inside poured out. Dr. Martinez listened without interruption, taking occasional notes, her expression neutral but attentive. When Robert finally finished, emotionally exhausted from the telling, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. "What you're experiencing isn't unusual," she said. "You've been through a traumatic event compounded by forced secrecy. You discovered something dangerous that threatened your life, had your home taken over by authorities, were displaced from your normal routine, and then required to remain silent about all of it. That's a recipe for isolation and anxiety." She explained that trauma was often worsened by the inability to process it socially, to share the experience with others who could validate and support you. The government's necessary secrecy created a form of solitary confinement, where the traumatic event couldn't be integrated into Robert's life story because it couldn't be spoken about. It remained separate, toxic, growing more powerful in isolation. Over the next several months, Robert drove to Austin every 2 weeks for sessions with Dr. Martinez. Slowly, incrementally, the crushing weight began to lift. It didn't disappear. He still had nightmares occasionally, still felt the strangeness of living above the sealed facility. But it became manageable. Dr. Martinez taught him techniques for processing trauma without external validation, for accepting ambiguity and uncertainty, for finding meaning in experiences he couldn't fully share. She helped him understand that his isolation was a choice, not an inevitability. He could connect with people without telling them everything. He could have relationships that weren't based on complete transparency. He could build a life that incorporated his experience without being defined by it. The work was hard, often painful, but for the first time since October, Robert began to believe he might actually be okay. Spring arrived with the sudden intensity that characterized Texas seasons. One week everything was gray and dormant. The next, the fields exploded with wildflowers. Robert stood on his porch drinking morning coffee, watching bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush transform his property into a riot of color. The beauty was startling, almost aggressive in its vitality, and Robert found himself genuinely appreciating it for the first time in months. His sessions with Dr. Martinez were working. He was sleeping better, eating regularly, engaging with the world rather than hiding from it. The nightmares hadn't completely stopped, but their frequency had decreased, and when they came, he had tools for managing the anxiety they triggered. He was learning to live with what had happened, rather than being consumed by it. It wasn't the peaceful retirement he'd originally envisioned, but it was a life he could actually live. He'd also started cautiously rebuilding social connections. At Dr. Martinez's encouragement, Robert began attending a weekly breakfast gathering at the diner, a loose group of retired men who met every Thursday to complain about politics and tell old stories. The conversations were superficial, rarely venturing beyond sports and weather, but that superficiality was exactly what Robert needed. These were interactions that didn't require explaining his past or justifying his present. He could just be another retiree trying to fill his days, and nobody asked uncomfortable questions. One of the men, a former rancher named Bill Patterson, lived about 3 miles down the road and had started occasionally stopping by Robert's property to chat about land management and offer advice on maintaining the acreage. The friendship was casual, built on shared practical concerns rather than deep emotional intimacy, but it was connection. It was normal. It was enough. In April, Robert's daughter Sarah visited for a long weekend, her first trip to see the property since his purchase. Robert had been dreading it, worried that she'd sensed something wrong, that the house would somehow reveal its secrets despite the concrete seal. But Sarah was delighted with the renovations, impressed by how he'd transformed the neglected Victorian into a comfortable home. She didn't go into the basement. There was no reason to. It was just storage now, and Robert didn't offer a tour of that space. They spent 3 days together, cooking meals, walking the property, talking about her life in Denver and his adjustment to retirement. When she left, hugging him goodbye and saying how happy she was that he seemed content, Robert realized she was right. He was content. Not perfectly happy, not without complications, but genuinely okay for the first time since October. The compensation money had allowed Robert to consider options beyond just personal comfort. In May, he contacted a local community foundation about establishing a scholarship fund for students from Gonzales County pursuing engineering degrees. He set up an endowment of $100,000, structuring it to provide 2 scholarships annually in perpetuity. The foundation's staff was delighted, asking if he wanted the fund named after him or a family member. Robert thought about it, then requested it be named in honor of Howard Brennan. The staff assumed Brennan had been a friend or mentor, and Robert didn't correct that assumption. But privately, it felt like a way of acknowledging Howard's burden, of doing something constructive with money that had come from buried secrets. It didn't erase the past, but it created something positive from its complicated legacy. He also began seriously engaging with the property's potential. 20 acres was too much land to simply maintain as unused pasture. Robert researched native plant restoration, contacted extension agents about conservation programs, and eventually enrolled 5 acres in a habitat restoration project focused on Texas grasslands. The work gave him purpose beyond his own comfort. He was contributing to something larger, creating value that extended past his personal needs. He planted native grasses, installed nest boxes for bluebirds, created small wetland areas that attracted migrating waterfowl. The physical labor was satisfying, and watching wildlife return to the restored habitats provided a sense of accomplishment that renovating the house never quite achieved. He was building something rather than hiding, creating rather than concealing. By summer, Robert's life had developed a rhythm that felt sustainable. He maintained his therapy sessions but reduced frequency to monthly rather than bi-weekly. He participated regularly in the Thursday breakfast group and had developed genuine friendships with several of the men, including Bill Patterson, who'd become something like a best friend despite their relationship being built more on comfortable silence than deep conversation. He continued his restoration work on the property, expanding the project to encompass 10 acres. He started dating a woman named Margaret Simmons, a widowed librarian from the next town over, whom he'd met at a community lecture on Texas history. The relationship was careful, neither pushing for rapid intimacy nor maintaining distance. They had dinner once a week, occasionally took day trips to nearby attractions, enjoyed each other's company without needing to define what they were to each other. What would you do if you were in Robert's position? Could you find peace after discovering something so disturbing? Would you stay in that house, or would the knowledge drive you away? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear how you'd handle this incredible situation. And if you've been captivated by Robert's journey from discovery to resolution, make sure you've hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the hidden stories that shaped America. One evening in August, Robert was sitting on his porch watching the sunset when Margaret joined him, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. They'd been seeing each other for 3 months now, and she'd become a comfortable presence in his life. She settled into the chair beside him, and they sat in companionable silence for several minutes before she spoke. "You know, you've never really told me why you moved out here," she said, her tone casual but genuinely curious. "You mentioned leaving Houston, wanting quiet, but there's always more to these stories. What were you really running from?" Robert felt his chest tighten. This was the moment he'd been avoiding, the conversation that would either deepen their relationship or end it. He couldn't tell her the truth, but he also couldn't build something real on evasion. He chose his words carefully. "I wasn't running from something exactly. More like, I needed to simplify my life. After my divorce, after years of work that felt meaningless, I wanted to strip away the complexity and find out who I was underneath all the roles and responsibilities. It was true, if incomplete, but I learned that you can't escape complexity. You can change your location, your circumstances, but you bring yourself with you. And life has a way of being complicated no matter where you are." Margaret listened, nodding slowly. "So, did you find who you were underneath?" she asked. Robert thought about it honestly. "I'm still figuring that out, but I'm learning to be okay with not having all the answers. That's something, right?" Margaret smiled. "That's everything, actually. Most people never get there. They spend their whole lives thinking certainty is around the next corner, the next job, the next relationship. Being okay with uncertainty is wisdom." They talked into the evening, conversation flowing easily from philosophy to practical matters to shared observations about the absurdities of small-town life. When Margaret eventually drove home, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced in months: genuine lightness. The secret beneath his house remained sealed. The knowledge of what had been there remained part of him, but it didn't have to define every moment. He could have connections, relationships, a life that incorporated his experience without being imprisoned by it. He could be more than the keeper of buried truths. In September, nearly a year after finding the flooded basement, Robert received a final letter from the FBI. It was brief, official, informing him that the investigation had been concluded and the site had been permanently closed. All materials had been safely decommissioned, all documentation had been archived according to classification protocols, and the matter was considered resolved. The letter thanked him for his cooperation and reminded him of his ongoing non-disclosure obligations. There was no signature, just a printed name of some administrator he'd never met. Robert read it twice, then filed it away in a drawer. That was it. The official end to a chapter that had nearly destroyed him. The government had taken its secrets back, sealed them away again, and moved on. Now, Robert had to do the same. But moving on didn't mean forgetting. On a cool October morning, exactly 1 year after he'd found the water in his basement, Robert descended the stairs carrying a small wooden box. He opened it, removing a photograph of the metal door he'd taken before the FBI arrived, the only image he'd kept, stored on a memory card he'd never shared with authorities. He also removed the compensation check stub, the final letter from the FBI, and a handwritten note he'd prepared. The note simply said, "To whoever finds this, what's beneath this house is sealed, but the truth should be remembered. Not all secrets deserve protection. Some should be known, even if they can't be spoken. Remember Howard Brennan. Remember that isolation is the price of silence." He sealed everything in a waterproof container and buried it in his yard, beneath the bluebonnet patch, marking the location in his private records. If something happened to him, if the house was eventually sold, maybe someday someone would find it. Maybe the truth would emerge again when enough time had passed that it no longer mattered to those who'd buried it. Or maybe it would stay hidden forever, just another secret in soil that held so many. Either way, Robert had made his peace with it. He'd done what he could. Now he could finally, truly, move forward with his life.